present. Sorry. It's okay. So, yeah, I'm really pleased to be here this morning and presenting in affiliation with our Monash Closing the Loop Studies unit. So we've got our students here at ITB, and it's great to be able to be here. So my name is Michaela Prescott. I'm a senior lecturer and DECRA fellow at Monash University's Faculty of Art, Design and Architecture. My work focuses on sustainability and participatory design, particularly in the context of environmental vulnerability. I've been working in Indonesia since 2012 across projects that seek to strengthen the role of local knowledge and design in how we address complex challenges like climate resilience, sanitation, and river restoration. Today, I'm going to share some reflections that emerge from this work, particularly in relation to the Citarum River and the broader questions of how we understand, manage, and design for rivers. My goal is to bring into conversation two bodies of knowledge that don't always speak to each other. On one hand, community-held wisdom about place, practice, and seasonal change, and on the other hand, design and infrastructure systems that often try to solve problems through centralised technical solutions. So in Australia, as my colleagues and everyone from home knows, before we begin a meeting or event, we recognise the traditional custodians of the land and their ongoing connection to it to show respect for people, culture and heritage. So today I'd like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners and elders, past, present and emerging, of the unceded lands and waters on which Monash University operates. I also acknowledge and pay respect to the communities of the lands and waters on which I work internationally, fishing and building their lives along its edges. These material and cultural practices are not just remnants of the past. They shape how the river functions today and how it might be repaired or revitalised in the future. So rather than focusing only on the technical solutions or the technical side of circular economy interventions, as our unit is focused around, I want to ask a slightly different set of questions. What does it mean to design for a river as a living archive of knowledge? How do we centre local relationships with water, waste and land in environmental planning? And how might listening to local knowledge systems improve the impact and durability of river management programs? So let's begin with the idea that rivers are more than infrastructure, more than pipes and banks and pollution loads. They're living systems embedded in place and shaped by human and non-human relationships over time. The Citarum River starts at Lake Cisanti, where our students travelled yesterday, high in the mountains of southern Bandung. It flows 270 kilometres through densely populated cities and agricultural plains before reaching the Java Sea. Along the way, it crosses ecosystems, economies, and cosmologies. From its source, the river has been seen not just as a physical feature, but as a vital presence, a being that connects land, people, and spiritual forces. Anthropologist Robert Wessing described the Javanese landscape as structured by what he called an ecological and spiritual gradient. At the top are the forested sacred mountains, places associated with purity, gods, and kingship. In the middle are settlements, gardens, and cultivated lands, sites of daily life. And at the bottom, along rivers and coasts, are the liminal zones, wetlands, floodplains, places of fertility and danger. These landscapes are connected symbolically to the sky, earth, and underworld, and to figures like the serpent goddess Nyai Lara Kidul, who's the guardian of the sea and bringer of life, health, or ruin. This gradient wasn't just symbolic. It informed the spatial organisation of villages, temples, and agricultural systems. And as architect Johannes Widodo has shown, many pre-colonial settlements were planned around cosmological principles, positioning important structures along a vertical axis, from mountains down to rivers. And in this way, rivers were not peripheral to human activity. They were central cosmologically and materially. And I've got another diagram to show this later on. So these ideas were embedded in the Sundanese kingdom of Tarumanagara, which flourished along the Citarum River, which is at the far right if you're looking at the screen, as early as the 4th century CE. Stone inscriptions from the period record the importance of channel maintenance, river trade, and wet rice agriculture, all of which depended on managing water carefully and respectfully. The same logic carried through into the vernacular settlement patterns. Kampungs were typically located between high ground and the waterways. Community structures were placed higher up, and functions associated with impurity, like burial, waste, or animal pens, were located closer to the riverbanks and water. In this way, cosmology was embedded in everyday infrastructure decisions. Design wasn't just a matter of efficiency, it was a matter of order, meaning, and relationship with landscape. Water in these systems of knowledge is not just a resource, it is a social and spiritual force. It flows through stories and ceremonies. It shapes behaviour, ritual, and belief, and it demands reciprocity. This is a very different view from the instrumental approach that treats rivers as channels for waste or flood control, and yet both views exist in tension with contemporary management in rivers today. Even now, for many Kampong residents living along the Citarum, the river is a source of water, food, materials, and sometimes spiritual connection. It's a place for washing, gathering, or planting, a space of exchange. These everyday practices are often invisible to planning systems, but they represent a wealth of environmental knowledge about seasonality, pollution, species, and flow that is critical if we want to close the loop in a meaningful and durable way. And if we're going to intervene in systems like the Citarum, whether through infrastructure design or circular economy initiatives, we need to begin with a deeper understanding of these histories and relationships. Otherwise, we risk designing systems that are technically correct, but socially and culturally disconnected. To understand why the Citarum has become such a contested space, environmentally, economically, and socially, we need to situate it in both its historical and contemporary context. The Citarum River is the longest river in West Java, the third longest on the island. It begins in the mountains near Kertasari and flows northward, as I said, for 270 kilometres until it reaches the Java Sea. Along its course, the river supplies water to more than 30 million people, not only within its own course and basin, but through interbasin transfers that service Jakarta and agricultural zones far beyond its banks. The Citarum is also the site of intense material flows. Every day, approximately 200,000 tonnes of solid waste and 280,000 tonnes of wastewater are discharged into the river system. This includes domestic sewage, industrial effluent, agricultural runoff, and plastic debris. While some of this is captured by formal infrastructure, a significant proportion enters the river untreated. The visible impacts are devastating, and in many stretches, especially midstream near urban industrial zones, the Citarum is choked with trash, discoloured by toxins, and stripped of aquatic life. It has been described in international media, although I guess 2 decades ago now, as the world's most polluted river. And yet, despite the environmental degradation, the river remains vital. It irrigates rice fields, cools power plants, and feeds major reservoirs like Saguling, Chirata, and Jatiluhur, which collectively supply nearly 80% of Jakarta's water. It sustains livelihoods through fishing, sand mining, farming, and increasingly community-led ecotourism. So here we have a contradiction. The Citarum is simultaneously a toxic sink and a life-giving resource, a river of crisis and continuity. And this duality plays out most sharply in the lives of those who live closest to its banks. Many of the communities, especially informal settlements, exist in highly vulnerable landscapes. They may lack secure tenure, basic infrastructure, or access to safe water, but they also rely directly on the river for a range of everyday services: washing, disposal, groundwater recharge, harvesting edible or medicinal plants, even recreation. And as researchers like Bulmer and Gregory point out, these riverine households derive multiple ecosystem services from the corridor, even when the river itself is already compromised. And so this is where a more nuanced understanding of river systems becomes essential. In formal planning frameworks, rivers are usually treated as infrastructure, engineered systems to be controlled, dredged, channeled, or covered. But in many kampong contexts, rivers are more like a shared commons, part of the relational economy of use, care, and negotiation. When these systems are overlooked, we fail to grasp how interventions, even well-intentioned ones, might disrupt local ecologies of place and practice. So the disconnect has historical roots. During the Dutch colonial period, large parts of Java's swampy lowlands were drained and converted for plantation and urban use. Indigenous communities were displaced or resettled into marginal landscapes, often those most exposed to flooding or poor quality water. Post-independence, river development was shaped by national priorities around irrigation, energy, and urban expansion. While these initiatives delivered important gains, they also deepened existing inequalities, especially in peri-urban and informal contexts. In the last few decades, the dominant mode of river management has been what we might call command and control engineering. Grey infrastructure approaches like concrete embankments, pumps, seawalls, and sediment dredging. These are often expensive, centralised, and disconnected from daily life. When they fail, as they did in the 2007 Jakarta floods, the impacts are catastrophic communities. And at the same time as all of these activities that I've just summarised, a parallel movement has been growing, community-driven environmental stewardship. Across the archipelago, we've seen the rise of river-based social movements, citizen cleanups, and small-scale remediation projects grounded in local knowledge. These are not just acts of necessity, they're expressions of agency, identity, and a different way of relating to the river. The Indonesian government has begun to recognise this. Programs like the Satgas or River Task Forces and local action plans increasingly draw on the expertise of community-based organisations. But a gap still remains between national frameworks and local realities. Many planning instruments are still structured around quantitative indicators like water quality, flow volume, and infrastructure budgets, without sufficient attention to lived experiences or qualitative outcomes like health, dignity, and place attachment. There is also a tendency to treat local knowledge as ornamental, something to inspire facade patterning or tree selection, rather than as a rigorous system of observation, adaptation, and governance. As Kittle notes, when Indigenous or local knowledge is engaged superficially, we miss the opportunity to learn from its deeper logics. In fact, some of the most compelling environmental thinking in Indonesia today is coming from the margins, from kampungs, farming collectives, and faith-based traditions that view rivers not as rivers not only as drainage infrastructure, but as living beings that deserve care. So if we accept that the Citarum is not just a river in crisis, but also a cultural system, a living archive of ecological relationships, then we have to ask, how can this knowledge be used not only to critique current models, but to shape alternatives? And so this is where I want to turn to next, towards the role of local knowledge systems in imagining more circular, more inclusive, and more durable interventions. So far, I've talked about rivers as cultural landscapes and the multiple, often conflicting ways in which the Citarum is used and understood. In this section, I want to focus on how local knowledge systems or local wisdom can actively contribute to the way we design and manage rivers, not as an add-on or symbolic reference, but as a source for robust, situated intelligence. So if we begin with a working definition, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, defines local knowledge systems as the understandings and skills developed by individuals and communities that are specific to the places in which they live. This knowledge is context-specific, developed iteratively over time, and embedded in local institutions. It often includes environmental cues, social norms, and seasonal rhythms that are invisible to outsiders, but critical to long-term resilience. In the context of river systems, this can include everything from how riverside villages observe changes in rainfall to rituals and taboos around certain water bodies, and to the practical knowledge of how to plant, fish, or build in flood-prone areas. For example, many communities along the Citarum engage in small-scale water harvesting, use natural indicators for planting seasons, or follow inherited patterns of building orientation that reflect spiritual and environmental considerations. These practices might seem modest, but they form part of a larger system of knowledge, one that links the material, ecological, and symbolic dimensions of place. What's important here is the epistemology of how knowledge. In many local contexts, knowledge is held collectively, passed on orally, and embedded in practice. It is relational rather than extractive. That means that its legitimacy doesn't come from a written report or a technical data set, but from being tested over time in daily life through observation and intergenerational transmission. A powerful example of this is the 15th century Sundanese text Bujanga Manik, which documents the journey of a hermit prince across Java. In this text, it describes over 450 place names, rivers, mountains, and villages, many of which still exist today. This is a form of oral geography, a mapping of the land through story and memory that reflects deep environmental literacy. And yet, because it's not written in scientific or policy language, it often doesn't register as data. In the same way, many of the insights held by kampong residents about pollution flows, land shifts, or underground water changes remain undervalued in formal decision-making processes. In most river management planning frameworks in Indonesia, knowledge tends to flow in one direction, from engineers or consultants to the community. Local voices may be consulted, but rarely are they treated as knowledge holders in their own right. At best, local wisdom is mobilised for behaviour change campaigns. At worst, it's ignored entirely. And this matters because when we don't take local systems seriously, we risk designing interventions that are technically sound but socially misaligned. For instance, a centralised waste treatment facility might be located for maximum efficiency, but without regard to community movement patterns, maintenance capacity, or historical land use. It might be poorly used or even resisted. So through my work with the RISE program and other community-based projects, I've seen how local knowledge can be made visible, not by translating it into technical language, but by creating platforms where different knowledge systems can interact. This might include participatory mapping, intergenerational storytelling sessions, or field walks, where residents explain how the landscape has changed over time. These are not just engagement activities, they're methods for eliciting complex, situated expertise that would otherwise be missed. One particularly important concept in Indonesian local knowledge is gotong royong, mutual cooperation. This is often viewed as a cultural value, but it's also a governance mechanism. Many kampongs use gotong royong to recover after disasters, to manage drainage systems, to maintain shared spaces, or regulate local waste flows. It's a form of distributed maintenance, circularity embedded in social norms. What would it mean to design infrastructure that supports rather than supplants these systems of mutual care? For example, residents in several communities have developed flood warning systems that utilise a public announcement board to regularly publicise the water level at each water gate from the upstream Chiliwung River, as well as electronic walkie-talkies to communicate with water gatekeepers in real time. The success of that system wasn't due to new technology, it was due to alignment with existing rhythms and responsibilities. And of course, I don't want to romanticise local knowledge. It's partial, contextual, and always evolving. It can also reflect social inequalities. For example, the marginalisation of women or minority groups. But it is precisely because local knowledge is grounded in lived experience that it offers insights that formal models often miss, about risk perception, about coping strategies, about where and how people actually interact with the river. One major barrier is that planning and budgeting systems don't allow for the time, flexibility, or relational labour required to surface and integrate these insights. Projects are evaluated on timelines and targets, not on relationships or cultural fit. So part of the challenge and opportunity is to shift from a consultation mindset to one of co-production. This means not only involving communities in delivery, but in framing the problem, selecting interventions, and defining what success looks like. It means designing processes that allow formal and informal knowledge to coexist, without one being reduced to the other. So it brings me to the next section, how we might translate these insights into spatial and design terms. If circular economy principles are to be more than just imported technical solutions, they need to be grounded in the social and ecological logics already present in place. What does circularity look like through a Kampong lens? How might design work with, rather than against, existing systems of reuse, care, and stewardship? In this section, I want to explore how the principles of circular economy, which are at the heart of this studies unit, can be interpreted through the lens of local practice and knowledge. The dominant narrative of circular economy tends to focus on flows of materials, reducing, reusing, recycling, and on closing industrial loops through technological innovation. This is important work, but in the context of the Citarum and other rivers like it, we need to ask, whose loops are we closing? Whose systems are we intervening in? Because in many kampongs and peri-urban areas along the river, circularity is not an abstract model. It's an embedded logic, one that already exists in the practices of daily life. Let me give you a few examples. In neighbourhoods, food waste is collected separately and either composted or used to feed livestock. Plastic waste is sorted by informal waste pickers and sold to local aggregators. Cooking oil is filtered and reused. Broken appliances are repaired or stripped for parts. Water is drawn from shallow wells, used for cleaning and sometimes redirected for garden irrigation. Sediment is drawn from the river and used for brick making or to fill sandbags to protect residents from floods. None of these practices are framed explicitly as circular economy, but they embody many of the same principles: resource efficiency, value retention, decentralised systems, and crucially, they are embedded in social relationships, not just technical systems. These photos show how water flows in a typical kampong settlement. Water is drawn from shallow wells or pipe supply, used for cooking, cleaning and sanitation, and then discharged as grey water and black water. In many areas, this wastewater flows untreated into open drains or rivers, but communities also manage wastewater informally, reusing grey water for plants, fish, diverting stormwater or timing water use to minimise flooding. Now imagine introducing a formal CE intervention, such as a decentralised wastewater treatment system. If the design doesn't align with daily routines, space constraints, or community priorities, it may be underused or poorly maintained. Without local alignment, even well-designed systems risk becoming idle or failed infrastructure. In one pilot project under the RISE program in Makassar, our team co-designed a nature-based wastewater treatment system with Kampong residents. It treated kitchen and toilet wastewater by pumping wastewater to a septic tank, flowing through constructed wetlands, reducing environmental contamination while creating reusable water for non-potable uses. Critically, the system was designed in close alignment with local knowledge, placed in shared spaces, connected to trusted households, and supported by local maintenance routines. Community members were involved in system monitoring and upkeep through Gotong Royong. The success of the pilot wasn't just about engineering. It was about fit, ecological, spatial, and social. When infrastructure listens to local practice, it's more likely to be sustained. So what does this mean for designers? It means that CE interventions shouldn't begin with the technology. They should begin with listening to flows, relationships, everyday practices. Design becomes a tool, not for imposing systems, but for translating between them, for creating interfaces where formal and informal logics can meet, and maximising co-benefits like water reuse for communities. In Kampong contexts, infrastructure is often incremental, collective, and adaptive. So CE design needs to be the same. It needs to be partial, negotiable, and open to co-evolution. In another pilot project under the Citarum Living Lab in Paramukti, near Bandung, our team co-designed a waste precinct with Kampong residents. Embedded within a broader river revitalisation master plan, this site functions as a waste collector for processing space, a social space, food source, and teaching site. These are infrastructures that speak both technical and social languages. They hold multiple meanings and are maintained through relationships. This is where local knowledge becomes critical because it offers clues about where infrastructure wants to sit, how it might be maintained, and who needs to be involved for it to function long term. The shift in thinking from technical optimism to cultural grounding changes how we approach design. It means we don't just assess outputs and inputs, but also relationships, rituals, rhythms, and roles. And it suggests that to design well for circularity in places like the Citarum Basin, we need to engage not only engineers and planners, but also residents, elders, waste workers, herbalists, religious leaders, anyone who has a role in shaping how materials move through a place. So here's a simple table that attempts as a first go to summarise this alignment. It's not to say that all CE models should be localised in this way, but it is to say that context matters, that a constructed wetland in Melbourne is not the same as one in Bandung, or even that one in Bandung is not the same as one in Jakarta or Makassar. Circularity, if it is to be social just, must take form through place. So keep these ideas in mind, look for existing loops, trace how waste already moves, ask what systems of care already exist and how your design might support or extend them. I've got a few provocations to end, not as project themes, but as tools for reframing. Questions that you can carry into your work, mapping, design processes. They're meant to prompt deeper listening and bolder thinking. Across Java and Southeast Asia, rivers have long been revered as sacred entities, beings with agency, not just channels for flow. In contemporary planning, the idea often gets lost. Rivers are treated as degraded infrastructure or as spaces to be controlled, restored, or engineered. But what if we approach them differently? What if we recognise them as living systems with cultural memory? How would that change the way we design? Would we create thresholds, rituals, points of reverence? Would we design with softness rather than domination? It's not about mysticism, it's about ethics. When a system is treated as sacred, its stewardship becomes shared, sustained, and careful. One of the things you'll notice as you spend time on the river is that waste, like water, follows seasonal patterns. During the rainy season, organic waste might move differently. Flooding might redistribute debris. The volume of packaging waste might increase during holidays. People's practices shift in response to these cycles. What if the design didn't assume a fixed system, but a responsive one that contracts and expands with the rhythms of life. How would it affect material storage, labour routines, or public space design? Designing for seasonal variation, or even designing seasonally with communities, opens up a space for adaptability. It makes room for systems that are alive rather than static. Earlier on, I mentioned Gotong Royong, the mutual collaboration or cooperation principle embedded in many kampong settings. This isn't just a value system, it's a logistics system. People come together to clean drains, fix footpaths, maintain water points, set up for weddings and funerals. It happens routinely with food, conversation, and pride. What if interventions were embedded in time and rhythm linked to these social practices, shaped by community participation and meaningful beyond the immediate function? What if you embedded responsibility and celebration into the infrastructure itself? When infrastructure becomes a ritual, it becomes embedded in culture, and that's what makes it last. And finally, think of a design not as an active intervention, but of translation. Your role isn't to impose new systems, but to reveal and strengthen existing ones, to translate between worlds, the technical and the lived, the policy and the myth, the linear and the circular. This will require you to listen carefully, to hold space for contradiction, to treat interviews, site walks, and informal conversations as design research, not just for data collection, but for understanding relationships. Design at its best helps people see their own knowledge reflected back at them, with care, clarity, and respect. So to close, I want to return to where we began, the idea of a river as a living archive. The Citarum holds thousands of years of cultural, spiritual, ecological, and material histories. It holds stories of sacredness and pollution, of abundance and decline, of human ingenuity and institutional neglect. But above all, it holds potential. Your challenge as students, designers, and future practitioners is not only to imagine what the river could be, but to recognise what the river already is: a teacher, a neighbour, a network, a body with memory. If we take seriously the idea that rivers are not just natural assets, but cultural beings, then our task becomes not just to fix them, but to be in a relationship with them. That means listening deeply, designing carefully, and closing loops, not just in materials, but in meaning. Thank you.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Michaela. That was perfectly pitched to what we're doing. I'd like to open it up for questions now from anyone. Also, welcome to all the RTB students who have arrived. Thank you for joining us very much. And I encourage you to ask any questions or any comments you may have too.
We've got a few people listening in on Zoom too. So Sri, if you want to bring up any questions that might come from our Zoom audience too.
Great. So would anyone like to start off with an initial comment or question at all? All right, I'd like to kick it off. So, Michaela, thanks so much for the lecture. It was fantastic and really well pitched, especially given our site visit yesterday, where we saw this in person, in practice, right? We saw the shared land use up in Lake Chisanti with local community stewards, as well as a broader state intervention. How do you see the relationship between bigger projects like say, for example, the Lake Chisanti rehabilitation, which had SACGUS involved and everything, aligning with land use of existing communities? Have you seen much of that in your work in more dense contexts where there's been cooperation between state interventions and community stewardship?
Good question. So I hope our Zoom audience could hear the question. It was about the alignment of local land management practices with government implementation of projects. So I think it's been really challenging to date. It's something that I touched on in my presentation as, I guess, being a bit emergent, I would say. Historically, there wasn't a lot of space in government management processes for local communities to, I guess, make recommendations or even provide feedback. A lot of the past projects operated through a mode of consultation, or as it's called, socialisation, where the program scope is shared with the community, and the community may be offered the opportunity to input on very targeted questions that might be seen as particular problem areas for the project. I think what I'm trying to suggest through my work and through the research that I'm doing at the moment is that there needs to be a much more open-ended approach to working with communities from the outset. And I think this is not always immediately possible within government programs. As I mentioned, because of things like limited budgets, quick timelines, different metrics for reporting on a program throughout its lifespan. So what I would be advocating for, I guess, is for local groups, communities, like the ones that I guess I mentioned in my presentation. For example, Communitas Buduli Chiliwung was one very strong advocacy group that sort of operates in a networked way throughout the Chiliwung River catchment. And I think through these kind of advocacy platforms, often communities are able to engage a lot more with the government planning processes at the moment. It's through partnerships with NGOs, with local groups, that I think community perspectives are really having a say in programs. And that's something that's really, I guess, been a newish thing that's also being recognised by the government, and the government is partnering not only with universities, with local NGOs, as I said, and with local communities, but I do think there's space for more of it.
Interesting to note too that on our site visit the other week, the role of the private sector being a big funder as well. So there are these multiple players involved too. Any other questions from anybody?
Thank you very much for the presentation, by the way. You were talking about like the circular flow of water, like it was that slide, if you wouldn't mind bringing it up, where you were sort of like talking about the sort of implementation, like when you guys try to implement a new system, sort of that, and then the next ones, So with this one, obviously you said that you had a lot of communication with the local groups. You had, I'm going to guess, you asked a lot of questions with them, asked for feedback, any plus points or minus points as well. And I'm going to guess when you were going, like wanting to like create the things underneath, when you're digging in, that was with the consideration of the actual land uses, what they were using prior and whatnot. In order to get that sort of data, that consultation, how open do you need it to be, like in order for them to get their sort of voice across? Because there's a lot of times if you just present something and then you ask, is this good or not? Many times they won't understand it until they see it, and then it'll be like, oh, but I don't really like this. How open do you try to leave it so then it's open to changes and implementations in the future?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in this particular case, we had a predefined technical system for dealing with wastewater, and I guess we were working with it as a series of parts. Depending on where you implement it, all of the pieces are required, or just a few of the pieces are required, if that makes sense in a really basic way. So as part of our community engagement strategy, we had a local team of Indonesian staff from Makassar that were out on site every day, multiple times a month. We had a program of co-design or participatory engagement program where we presented the technical aspects of the system to community, but we also talked about the different ways that system could be implemented alongside their existing lives, and the potential benefits that it could bring. When we came to doing design, we walked with residents, household by household, through the system. So we looked at the land that was available out the front of their home. We looked at existing land uses, and we talked about how their wastewater was currently being managed. For example, were they managing it with other households? Did they already have a shared system? We looked at the different impacts that implementing a new system might have, and we stepped it all out, and we marked it out physically within the community, and then we left it for a few days, and we said, okay, talk about this with the family members that weren't here, who might need to be part of this decision-making process. And then we came back again and we revisited, we made changes. We documented it. That was concept design. Then a few months later, we did detailed engineering design. Some things had changed in the community. These are not static environments. So then there were some changes that had to get integrated for detailed engineering design. And the same thing again for construction. There were still some things that had already changed in the community, even though the plan had been drawn and the engineering had been set, and the changes that needed to happen were made on site. So I guess what's to say, the process that we did here is quite time intensive. A lot of existing programs don't have the financial capability to deal with this, but I guess a lot of existing programs, taking stock that this was a research project that was being implemented in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, had a lot of interruptions and probably took a bit longer than the standard government sanitation program. So I guess as much consultation and engagement and involvement as possible would be the way that I'd look at it.
More questions? There's maybe someone from...
Yes.
For us, if it takes some resistance from the witness, and that ever happened, maybe? How did you handle this?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So for the Zoom audience, in case you couldn't hear, it's a question about what are the tensions that you might experience during engaging with a community, and is there ever, I guess, reluctance to participate? So I guess, yes, in RISE, we did have some pushback in often, no, not often, but in some instances. There were residents and families who chose not to participate in the program. We took the approach of we would like everyone to be connected to the system. It has a real range of health and wellbeing benefits, but it must be consented. It must be something that the household and the family wants to be part of and agrees to be part of. So in some cases, there were households that chose not to participate, and that was it. In other cases, we had communities who'd been through, I guess I could say, trauma in the past from the way that other programs had been implemented. Programs that were implemented without consent, where land was being taken and used for a program that maybe the community didn't see value in or didn't have the same amount of benefit from than another stakeholder that was a recipient of the project. In cases like that, our local team worked really carefully because I think from a project perspective, we saw value, but we weren't going to do anything that wasn't what the household or the resident wanted. And there were households that initially were quite concerned who later came on board to the program. So I think if there's value for everyone and the participants can see the value and the benefit, then there's a future for a project, I guess.
Very briefly for that. Sorry to jump in, but also it's important to note that this is the outcome of years of work. But this isn't sketched up from nothing, right? So what Michaela's talking about is a long process of community engagement and communication with participating communities. So if that's how it works, it wasn't a matter of walking in and communicating simply. It was a long process of co-development, co-design.
Yeah, I mean, our team, just to add, our team were very present within these community settings. They would be invited to weddings, funerals, gatherings, and they became, really accepted, I guess, members of those communities through the program of work. There was another question up the back.
Yeah, I think it was very interesting on your presentation. What I want to know is about how long do you involve in Makassar? Because actually I have a project as well in Makassar City about from the mayor's policy. Things that you know about the green alley in Makassar City. That's I already involved for maybe 5 years from now. And actually I have a difficulty to involve in the communities in Makassar. But it's not difficult than other provinces in Indonesia. Because I think communities in Makassar is more convenient and than other provinces in Indonesia. What I want to know is about how long do you involve in this community in Makassar in your projects? And actually about the gotong royong itself, what do you suggest to us about gotong royong to develop
It's also similar question and
Go for it, sorry.
from Choirunisa Nur Syahid. It's very interesting presentation. I just curious about the research methods that you use. Is it ethnography or any other methods to gain the community perception? And is there any similarities between people in Jakarta, Bandung, and Makassar that you see regarding to the perception of on the river? Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so for the question from the back, we've been working in Makassar since around 2016. So it's, like I said, it's a long project. We first, I think the communities originally agreed to participate in the second half of 2017. And we began engaging from an infrastructure design perspective, probably in late 2018, early 2019. So there was a long period, I could say, of trust building that came through the project and through our team's involvement in, like I said, in day-to-day interactions. The other unusual aspect of the project is that we have teams that are in this community not only for the design and implementation of these technical systems, but also for community health monitoring and environmental monitoring. And so that means from a whole of project perspective, our program has, I guess, a very visible and frequent presence in the community, which I imagine has a significant impact on the way that the program is perceived and how residents actually choose to participate as a result. I think in relation to the question about gotong royong, I'm an outsider. So I know that I feel a little bit uncomfortable today presenting my research because I am an outsider. I don't speak Bahasa Indonesia. I'm very interested in the challenges that are being experienced here in relation to waterways. But I have I'm always going to be a step removed from everything that I do and also in the way that I understand a situation. So with that in mind, I will answer the question about Gotong Royong as an outsider's kind of viewpoint. I think it's difficult for vulnerable communities to constantly be seen as you have the capacity, you are resilient, you're already dealing with these things, so therefore you can take on another responsibility in the absence of funding or programs to manage X problem on your own. I find this really challenging and difficult, I think, to engage in, because on the whole, we're looking at a situation where we have inadequate service provision, inadequate management of issues that are really big issues. So when I say we should draw on local culture and knowledge like Gotong Royong, I'm not saying that the community should therefore take responsibility for filling the gap. What I'm seeing is that when we implement a decentralized system like this, there are certain things that maybe require a little amount of maintenance in order for the system to be successful long term. For example, the plants need to be trimmed and maybe waste needs to be taken out periodically if there's solid waste. But there is still a really big responsibility for the government in implementing and maintaining this system. We worked with the local Makassar government to identify which aspects of the system the government was going to be responsible for, and also with the community to identify which aspects of the system they thought they could do within their own skills and expertise. And so it's a partnership. So I see the Gotong Royong as something that can support an approach like that, but I don't see it as filling the gap for other funding and services. The question about local or differences across different rivers, I'm still exploring. I haven't really done a lot of immediate case study comparison between local practice and comparing and contrasting them, I guess, between different cultural contexts, because for me, again, as an outsider, I find that the immediate cultural context is something that takes a long time to understand, and maybe I'm not the best person to do that. But I'm really interested in the sort of the socio-cultural ways of engaging with these systems and how that relates to the way that space is modified and used and designed around rivers. And so that's where I see my sort of expertise or contribution potentially playing a role. There was a question again about how do you do your work? I do use approaches like ethnography, design ethnography, but again, I'm someone who can't speak Bahasa Indonesia, so I also rely very much on having a local partner, a local research assistant, yeah. So, thank you.
Ilya, you had a question before. You still.
It was just in relation to some of the conversations we've had before was, say, you're in a community speaking to people from the community and they say that their problem is the people in the other community and their waste coming down the river. And so have you seen their cooperatives or their initiatives where people partner for, say, a whole artery or something like that across it to try and manage it that way? Or is it really fragmented, like this community is doing one thing and the other community is doing a completely other thing? And it's all just,
Yeah, good question. I mean, this is a really big catchment that we're sort of standing within, the Citarum, right? And the challenge of the person or the family or the village who lives at the mouth of the river, like Muara Gombong that we visited, is that they get everything from everyone else. And so there's a really strategic reason, I guess, therefore, why from a project perspective, our Citarum Living Lab has chosen a site in an upstream tributary in Bandung, because the challenges are maybe slightly less, but still very complicated than in other sites that are further downstream in the catchment. I'd like to just draw your attention. So so far, one of the approaches that I've seen that has taken maybe a multi-sited approach to managing a challenge could be this Comunitas Peduli Chiliwung, which translates to, I think, caring, the community that cares for the Chiliwung. And they have been working in along the Chiliwung River, which runs through the centre of Jakarta, Depok, and Bogor. And they have, in specific locations along the river, different groups, NGO groups of volunteers that come together to do different activities. And so they're doing things like mapping polluters and reporting them, documenting fish species, doing weekly trash collection, mapping out new developments. They bring people on river tours. So I went down the river on a boat with this group, and that waste that you see on the right-hand side was something that we encountered when we went down the river. So we were on a boat, and we came to a bend in the river, and there had been a tree falling down, and the tree had fallen just before Eid al-Adha. And so this, idea of seasonality and rhythms and waste increasing around a major festival. Eid al-Adha is a festival of sacrifice. People get together, they have, celebrations within their community. They have, big parties, food, etc. And so this branch had fallen and blocked the river, and it was just sort of right on top of the water. And because all of the solid waste was coming down the river, it was just getting trapped behind this branch. And so these volunteers are literally standing on top of the floating waste with sticks and tools, trying to dislodge the waste and trying to get rid of the branch to allow the water to run freely again. I mean, that was an incredible thing to see, because it just kept coming. And it wasn't just waste, it was also livestock that hadn't made it to the festival. And so, I mean, I think there's a range of different, opportunities. And I think this particular group seemed to be having a really good network across the catchment. And certainly the government's recent program, where they've established river task forces, and they're inviting groups. So, like I said, academic representatives, community representatives, etc. This is, I think, a good approach, and it's just something to continue building on. And, the greater involvement and leverage that you can have with site-based knowledge contributors, then the better the outcome's going to be, I think, long term.
Also questions in the chat.
Yeah.
Or is there any other?
Oh, hey, Dave, we just had a question,
Okay.
but then maybe we can take one from the chat as well.
I enjoyed the presentation. I have one question about the, I guess there's a consistent thread throughout the entire presentation of incorporating informal and local knowledge. But what I wanted to ask was, how, as outsiders, can we engage in incorporating informal knowledge in a way that's not as biased, understanding that not only do we not speak the Bahasa Indonesia, but we also come from a different cultural context, and a different the barrier in multiple different ways of education. And secondary to that question, what are the risks of appropriating traditional forms of practice that land practice?
Good questions. Thanks, Terefa. So the second question was about how do you not appropriate local traditional or ecological knowledge? And the first question.
The most.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, I think while you were speaking, it struck me. I saw one of my PhD students, Sechel, is in our Zoom audience, and she's just about to submit. It's very exciting. And I used a couple of Sechel's images in my presentation. I hope she didn't mind. But Sechel has developed this this way of speaking about becoming familiar with a site and with a community or a river that she talks about called attunement. And I like the way that Sechel uses this term because I think it's sort of, for me at least, it comes a little bit from that perspective of recognizing that, yes, you're an outsider, but you are trying to understand what are the things that you're looking for to the signifiers, I guess, of community relationships or government intervention approaches. I mean, to a certain degree, all of us are outsiders to any site that's not our hometown in a way. So I think all of us would need to undergo a process of attunement to site, to local cultural context. So I think coming at it from that kind of perspective, along with the recognition that you are not trying to appropriate knowledge, that you're trying to understand what is happening, and that acknowledging the source of the knowledge, right? And where possible, partnering, you know, if you're talking about implementation, then partnering with the community, partnering with the residents to implement the whatever it is that you've designed alongside them. So I think there's some really good guides to ICIP, Indigenous Cultural. In Australia, at least, if you look up ICIP, then there are some good guidelines, I guess, for thinking about it alongside Indigenous Australian knowledge. And in the absence of such frameworks in Indonesia at the moment, at least from what I've seen, I refer to these because I think they're really strong and they provide a good guide for us, you know, as outsiders when working somewhere that is not our own home. Yeah.
We have time for one or two more. What time is it? Sorry, just keeping track of. Do you have time for one more? Or
maybe the last one from the Zoom. It's this one is from Pania. Hi, Michaela. Thank you for your presentation. You mentioned the theme of spiritual views of rivers. This is quite similar to indigenous/traditional owners' view of rivers here in Australia. And I'm logging here from Melbourne. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on how we can embed and learn from this approach in Melbourne or Australia, especially when planning for flooding or building flooding resilience.
Good question, Vania. I don't work really in Melbourne in this context, would be my starting point. But I think a number of years ago, when I first moved back to Australia after living overseas in Singapore for some time, I had the opportunity to be involved in a group that was mobilised by Melbourne Water around the Moonee Ponds Creek, which is a small urban creek in the northern suburbs of Melbourne. And this creek, in some senses, has similarities with some of the river management strategies that I've shared in my presentation. It is, it's channelized. It's effectively a concrete drain in its sort of downstream reaches as it discharges into the sort of Melbourne city area. And it exists within sort of suburban areas. with some kind of remnant natural, I say native-ish vegetation. So Melbourne Water brought together, they had a coordinator who was seconded from Melbourne City Council, actually. And they brought together groups from across the catchment, not too unlike this kind of task force idea, but different in implementation perspective. So there were local municipalities, local Indigenous representatives, there were local NGOs, local volunteer groups like the Friends of Moonee Ponds Creek, and they ran a series of stakeholder meetings. And so I think they had a really good model, I guess, that this was the first, as I understood it, collaboration group that they'd run. And since that time, there has now been a master plan was produced by one of the local councils, Moonee Ponds, Moonee Valley, maybe it's called. And the neighbouring council on the other side of the river also kind of came on board and said that they would do similar things and they would take a similar approach from a management perspective, which is really strong. And recently they've opened up a renaturalised kind of section of the creek, which our Melbourne students can go walk when you return home, I guess. But I think so that's one strategy of bringing together different stakeholders, not necessarily taking into account the spiritual knowledge systems and Indigenous knowledge systems that I think your question was specifically about. There is a Birrarung Yarra River Keeper. I'm saying this and I'm not convinced. I'm not 100% convinced of the term. So please check me on this, which is basically a position where which you can refer to, where they oversee management of the Birrarung River, and there's a lot of different, I guess, local Indigenous groups that have really strong agency around the Birrarung River, which is the main river for our Indonesian colleagues. It's the largest river running through the centre of Melbourne, and it actually has what's the word for it? It's got it's illegal. It's in itself a legal entity now and recognised as a being, which is also quite different, right? So there are some really good case studies globally of rivers being identified as having their own being, and being viewed therefore as having a stake in the management. So beyond the local communities, the river also has a say. And so the Yarra River Keeper, is one of these people or groups that's responsible for advocating for the river, as are our Indigenous communities in Melbourne. And there's some really good case studies, I think, for this in New Zealand as well, if we're looking kind of within our Asia Pacific region. Yeah, so hopefully I answered the question, but Vania.
We might leave it there now. We've had a number of questions and we can keep the conversation going afterwards. So thank you again, Michaela. Cheers.
Michaela again, and there is another question in the Zoom, but I think we can continue the discussion, and maybe you can share. You already shared the email or contact in the presentation, so
yes.
Please. Zahro Basima, thank you for the comments. You can reach out Michaela through the email. Maybe.
Yeah, I'm happy for you to drop me an email. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. And from SLPK ITB Architecture, we have something for you. Okay. Thank you so much for your time and the presentation. This is I think you already have one here. I very lovely, but this is a souvenir from SLPK. And the certificate. Thank you so much for coming today. And so for now, it's the end of the lecture. Thank you so much, Brendan, as well. And for the session after this, I'll leave the time and the space for you if you have the discussions and.
Great, thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for coming.
Okay, so now we've got this room now.